workshops, panels, etc. And these monthly events will culminate in an annual 3-day festival in May. So please watch out for that, but it's next year. This session is Mental Health in the City, Women in Focus, and we're hosting this in collaboration with Mindscapes, an international cultural program supported by the Wellcome Trust across Berlin, Tokyo, New York, and Bengaluru that aims to support a transformation in how we understand, address, and talk about mental health. I'm happy to introduce my speakers for today. We have Indu Anthony, who's a transdisciplinary artist based out of Bangalore in Kerala. Her works comprise of understanding feministic stance and often unites her larger practice. She understands the presence of gendered bodies in public spaces and has conversations around this with her long-standing project, Ceciliad. Anthony is passionate about community work and set up 2 community art centers. With the need for more women to enter the self-publishing space, she set up Marty Books. Thank you so much for being here. You can just... our next speaker is Dr. Neeti P., who's associated with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. She works on urban labor informality and focuses on women, informal workers, and various forms and responses from upcoming alternative labor associations. She's the author of Globalization Live Locally, a labor geography perspective, and Urban Undesirable, City Transition and Street-Based Sex Work in Bangalore. Thank you so much for being here. We also have Dr. Prabha Chandra, who's Dean of Faculty Behavioral Science and a Senior Professor of Psychiatry, as well as past Head of Department at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences in Bangalore, which is NIMHANS. She's a teacher, a clinician, and a researcher. Her main areas of work include maternal mental health and the impact of domestic violence on the mental health of women and children. Thank you so much for being here. And our moderator for this evening is Rohan Patankar, who is a senior design researcher and strategist at Quicksand, a transdisciplinary design thinking and innovation consultancy based in India. At Quicksand, his work focuses on the design and facilitation of communities of practice, participatory foresight in the humanitarian sector, and the intersection of research and cultural production. Supported by a team at Quicksand and Unbox Cultural Future Society, Rohan is a curatorial research fellow for Mindscapes in Bengaluru. Thank you. Just before we start, may I please request you to either put your phones on silent or switch them off. And over to you, Rohan.
Hello. Okay, great. Great, everyone's got their microphones. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Asha, for helping us put this together. Great. Great, thanks so much for being here, everybody. I'm really grateful that all of you could also be here with us today. I'll begin by speaking for a few minutes about what Mindscapes is, what we're all trying to do here, and then we'll move on with the program. As you heard from Asha already, Mindscapes is an international cultural program. It's spread between Bengaluru, New York, Tokyo, and Berlin. And really the intention is to use cultural work as a lever to talk about mental health research and policy at large. In Bangalore, Museum of Art and Photography is our key anchoring institution. We also have Indu, who's the artist in residence at the MAP. And along with it, there's a series of institutions that are working with us on this. There's the IIHS, NIMHANS, Fields of View, the Center for Mental Health Law and Policy, Science Gallery Bengaluru, and the India Foundation for the Arts, along with whom there's a range of independent creative practitioners that are working with us. And broadly, all of these people in Bangalore are working towards the idea of missing voices in everyday conversations on mental health and how cultural work can be used to surface some of their concerns. At large, these global projects are happening in parallel with each other, and they will culminate in an international convening, that's what we're calling it, in April 2023, which will be in Bangalore, and it'll be a week of activity, so that should be super exciting as well. This is a second set in a series of conversations that we've been doing at IHS. They're called Mental Health in the City. And this session, with a focus on women's lived experience, really started from a question that we had in the last session in May, where there was, at the end of a session, a young girl who said that I find it really challenging that, I'm a young working professional. I've studied, I speak English, and I live on the outskirts of the city. And every day in the evening from 7 to 8, my commute back home is a nightmare, right? My parents are totally paranoid, and it just leaves me underproductive, always nervous, and I don't know, and I feel like the city is letting me down just by design, and the city is not doing better, right? And much like this, some of the visuals you saw right now was this comic that the Luidists have designed, which is about how non-cis het males experience the city, right? And there's so much more that goes into the minds of people who are not males, just navigating streets, sidewalks, busy bus stands, etc., right? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Maybe also worthwhile to add at this point that it's a bit odd that I'm a man moderating this conversation about women's lived experiences. I fully recognize this. Also to flag, I am queer, so it helps that I have everyday opportunities in just remembering that on most days I don't feel enough. And maybe that qualifies me in some way. But also I'm informed by a whole sort of army of amazing women, colleagues, friends who work with me, and their really experiences informs my worldview as well. Also at large, we are talking about women's issues at a point where women's bodies and voices are being policed, not just in India, but not just in Bangalore, India, but all over the world in a way that they haven't been ever before. It is sobering also to remember that women's labor force participation in India has been at very, very low in a long period of time. The burden of care, we know, has fallen disproportionately on women since the pandemic, right? And some of these also literally translate to statistics on suicide rates in India. Dr. Chandra will, I'm sure, tell us more about this, but already NCRB data from 2021 says that housewives accounted for 51% of the total female victims of suicide, and they constituted to 14.1% of all the people in India that died by suicide, right? That's about 24,000 people in India, only in 2021. Just for some context, India's contribution to the global suicide deaths increased from 25% in 1990 all the way to 36% in 2016. It's only rising. And imagine 36% is about 1 in every 3 women in the world that have died by suicide have been Indian, right? Most of these women, as Dr. Chandra will also tell us, are young women under the age of 30. And these are staggering by any sort of notion and important for us to take note of, right? But it's nearly surprising that we're not angry about this. We're not asking for better. We're not asking for more from not just our cities, but also the people around us, our governments, and so on, right? So important, really important, we feel, to hold the space to hear these stories, right? About ourselves, about each other's experiences, and really then try to find meaning or meaningful pathways forward. In putting this discussion together, I came across a few resources that I thought might be useful to share with everyone. There's an amazing podcast already called Women in Labor. It's done by a comedian called Aditi Mittal and a filmmaker called Christina McGilway. Amazing podcast about just different aspects of women in the workplace. There's also Womaning in India, which is a newsletter. It's weekly and it's run by this amazing engineer, technocrat person called Mahima Vashisht. She's incredible, and she talks about everyday experiences through just stories week after week, right? And there's, of course, the amazing book, Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, by an economist called Shreyana Bhattacharya, who really focuses on the Indian economy, but from the point of view of the lives and loneliness of young women. I feel that these collated accounts are really helping us expand our understanding of lived experiences, and it's very useful to really front and center them in conversations in order to understand how we move forward from here. And this is really the intention of what we want to do here today. The stories that you will hear from all of them are about safety, about purpose, about belonging, also about love, loneliness, desire, delight, also hopefully. So it's not all grim and sad, but we want to learn about what's making women happy. And also in specific, like how design enables or disables a lot of this, right? Not just in the home, but also in the workplace, also on the street and in the public realm. We hope to unpack a bunch of this. We have about an hour and a half. I will keep looking at my clock. Our hard stop is at 8. We want to do 2 rounds of discussions. The first round is to hear a set of stories from everyone and just hearing from their experiences. And then in the next round, we'll understand how can we extract this for broader cultural conversations. And then hopefully we'll have about half an hour for everyone's questions and comments. Yeah. So we'll begin. And we want to learn about how women's experiences of mental health, mental well-being, as well as mental illness are often invisibilized in the city and invisible. And maybe we'll start with Neeti from IHS. Neeti is also doing a project as part of Mindscapes, also titled Mental Health in the City. And maybe, Neeti, if you could tell us how the design of the public realm enables or disables people and the mental health of women and particularly other marginalized groups. Over to Neeti.
Thanks, Rohan. So I'm a social scientist, and my research and teaching is mainly around the theme urban informality. I look at urban informal workers, and with special focus on women informal workers. So as Rohan has given us a kind of an intro to, or the background to all this, we heard that, women's work participation rate in India is one of the lowest. And if you take the working women, that category itself, we can see that more than 90% of them are involved in informal work. And within informal work, but that's another interesting thing, we must have heard the term informality quite often. But unfortunately, if you look at it from the policy and even from the legal aspect, it is used as a homogeneous category. But within informality, the vulnerabilities these workers face and the marginality, the different forms of marginality, especially with respect to work, workspace, working conditions, vary quite a lot. So in my research and my teaching, I focus mainly on the advanced marginalized informal women workers. So last couple of years, I've been working with street vendors, domestic workers, women in garment factories, and civic workers, that Paura Karmikas, what we call here. And my recent work, and my book is co-authored book is on street-based sex workers here in Bangalore city. So, why I'm giving such a kind of a broader outline about the category of workers I'm going to focus today is that already by calling them as informal workers, and I have used this term advanced marginalized category of workers, it's quite clear where they are as far as the economic status goes. But interestingly, if you look at the data, especially in India, the data says that most of the economically marginalized category of workers are part of highly marginalized social, they belong to highly marginalized social category as well. They belong to highly marginalized caste cohort as well. So we can see that when you place them, they stand in the crossroads of both economic variability and then gender, and then comes the social challenges as well. So when you look at a category, worker category like this, it's quite evident the kind of challenges they face in their everyday work and everyday life as such, right? So it is here that I feel, when we think about mental health, it's important to address the question of class. So interestingly, recent literature and recent discussion, caste is a major concern whenever we think about mental health and mental well-being, but class is also equally important, especially a country like India, where if you take 10 workers, more than 9 of them work in the informal category, and women workers, though mostly informal category of work and highly marginalized category of workers. So in this context, that's where I want to introduce this whole notion of class in the whole discussion. And another thing is that if you look at the everyday life or the stories which you have mentioned here, so the recent experience or my research with street-based sex workers, so we were looking at urban transition in the city. We were looking at nearly 30 years of Bangalore's experience with urban transition and everyday work and life of street-based sex workers. And we were looking at both male, female, and transgender sex workers. So what we could hear was, so we were asking them, how do you look at the city? What is city for you? Or how do you look at the changes in the city? So interestingly, whenever we look at a category like street-based sex workers, we don't really have any data, right? So in that way, we can say that numbers-wise, they are invisible. But at the same time, a city like Bangalore is quite different from Bombay or Calcutta or Delhi, where we don't have red light areas or zones, particular areas for street-based sex workers. So in that way, they are all over the city, right? And so the thing is that actually we walk through every day, and our recreational spaces are the spaces where we usually travel to go for our work, or where we meet our friends, or we find some space which is quite closer to us. It's actually their workspaces. So their city is in that way quite different from our city. But interestingly, they don't belong to the first-class inhabitants of the city, which is quite easy. They are not that category, right? The citizens of this city. They are not really identified as the citizens of the city. But the sad part is that they are not even part of the populations. That is second-class citizens. That is the informal work category here. That is, we don't really, their struggles and their challenges are mostly around how to recognize them as workers. So then can we just say that they are invisible here? No, because the numbers, during our discussions with the workers and with the organizations, told us, numbers are quite high. So, but the thing is that we can't just touch the numbers, right? So that's where we, during our discussions with them, very interesting category, that is pseudo-invisibles. That's what we use to actually identify these workers. That is, they move in and out of populations. And they are visible whenever the urban policy or the city planning, or whenever we want to basically modernize the city, or there is another term in urban studies, that revanchism. When we want to, that is the revent at which the cities are actually changing nowadays, So then we know how to actually not see them, how to keep them invisible. But at the same time, when we find them as a threat to our city, or when we want to market our city, right? In the sense, the urban imaginary of Bangalore, at one point it was Singapore, another point it was Dubai, and another point it was Shanghai. It's not, everything except Bangalore. That time we know how to keep them away, right? So that's where kind of your question about visible, invisible. So I would say, this category of workers perhaps fall into pseudo-invisible category. And same thing, we could see, it was quite evident, especially in the COVID time, the mass exodus of migrant workers, right, in the city. So they are super important as far as the city, any form of city growth or development goes. But as far as their lives or themselves goes, we know how to keep them invisible, right? And we were wondering, why is it that, where did they come from, right? In the sense, all of a sudden we could see that the mass exodus of people, and we were wondering, sitting in our safe spots and safe spaces with our children and with our new cooking experiments and reading experiments, we wondered, why are these people just walking? They have only one thing to say: even if we are going to die, we want to get back to our village. We want to be with our people. So that means that something wrong with the city, right? They don't really belong to a city. So if you don't belong to the space or a place, you naturally want to go back to the space where you feel you are attached to. You want to be in that spot. So that is another category we could see that we know how to invisibilize them. Same thing with the civic workers, the Paura Karmikas here. I don't know whether how many of you remember this during the time of COVID. Again, they were part of essential workers here. And we all don't want to get out of our house, but they have to come and clean our, what you call residential areas and our streets and all this. But, and the whole issue about, we are not ready to give them water, they can't clean, they can't come inside our compound, you be there, don't touch this thing, don't touch that thing. So again, we know how to make them essential workers, essential workforce, but we know how to invisibilize them. So it is here that we could see that most of these workers, and they are the major workforce in India, and they are the major workforce in any city, right? So they stand at the crossroads of whether it is the concerns around gender, or it's about economic vulnerability, or it is about social vulnerability, whichever way you look at. So I think I'll stop here. This is how I kind of, introduce this whole, the importance of looking at work, class, concerns about community, and all this, around mental health and mental well-being. Yeah.
Thank you, Neeti. I think also very interesting that you're saying that invisibility actually then disadvantages belonging in some way, right? Like, and they'll always be on other two ends of the spectrum. I want to move to Indu. And Indu, if you could speak to us about your work with women and how somehow you are a space maker to me, in that you make Namakate and you make Cecilia Ed. If you could talk about how the making of spaces for women that did not exist in the past, how does that visibilize women in the first place, but also their mental health needs in public space and in the city?
So to start with, I think before the pandemic, it was this project called Cecilia. And for me, as an artist, a lot of things comes from a very personal space. I was attacked on the streets, and I realized, why is this happening, and I need to talk about it. And we started looking at spaces and why they were safe or not safe, and also studying feminist geography and understanding why are certain spaces very much gendered. There are, if you look around, you would see a barber shop next to a mechanic shop, next to an alcohol shop. And these spaces, in some way, becomes very gendered. And subconsciously, a lot of women would avoid these spaces. So the lot of conversation was about trying to understand and make this project about safety for women in public spaces. That's how the whole project, Cecilia, came about. Every ad or every kind of campaign has a person in the forefront. I met Cecilia, and she's had a very hard life, and I said, okay, Cecilia, let's do this together. And I've known her for past 8 years now, and that's how the project came about. We would identify spaces that were quite unsafe through oral histories and also through people kind of telling us what these spaces were making them feel. And then we would also got reports from the police. We worked very closely with BBMP as well. And we got these reports and then realized, okay, how do we then create the street reopening? We did the street reopening sessions where we actually opened up a street which was already open, but to kind of create more awareness in these areas. So we did a pilot primarily in ward number 24. But we also moved it to talking about safety for women in public transport as well, looking at the metro primarily. So we also worked at the Vijayanagar metro station and made a small event and things there. If you go to the metro station, you would still see a large mural of Cecilia there. So that's how that project came about. We were then, the pandemic happened. A lot of the violence had kind of shifted into homes. And that's where a lot of the women that I was working with, I've been working with these Anganwadis for the past 3 to 4 years. And once the violence shifted inwards, a lot of the women were complaining about not having a space other than home because they were constantly scared. Alcoholism was quite high, and number of cases were increasing, and that's how the idea of Namakate came about. So this is a space which primarily is a leisure center. It's a space to, this was the opening of Namakate, which we celebrated very largely, where we all got together. One of the things I've always wanted to do was dance on the street. You know, as a woman, it's so hard to kind of, when they play those drums, I'm the first person who wants to go and like dance. So why are these spaces, again, not, you know, easy for us to express ourselves? So that's how Namakita came about. It also has a swing. So the space is primarily a leisure center, a space to sit, to relax, to scream, to scratch, to do whatever you want. There's a swing, you can sit and swing. So women use it as a leisure spot quite a lot. If you ever come by, you would see them sleep there, cut their vegetables there, but it became a safe space for them to come and kind of exist. If you see those cloth, which is there, right, these material, so this was like a sharing thing that we did where we started collecting blouse pieces and we were sharing stories, very personal stories of what has happened in our lives. And initially there was a lot of resistance to share these stories, but once they all sat together and they saw one person sharing, they realized, oh, this is something that I could do too. So initially we started with 10 to 15 stories, to today we are at 530 plus stories where women felt so comfortable to start sharing. Again, the concept of mental health is not very well spoken. But one of the things that the women constantly say is that once I come here, my mind becomes free. And that itself is like a good thing, you know. So we constantly have multiple things that happen in that space, but at the same time, like the other day we had two musicians who were traveling through Bangalore came and who performed there. And so they were like, oh, great, you know, instead of sitting at home and listening to my husband screaming at me, it was nice to just listen to other music. So it was nice in that way to kind of see multiple things happen in that space. That corner was known to have a lot of fights. One of the key thing was if there was a t-shirt torn and thrown, you know, there was a fight that happened the previous day. To today, the women have kind of taken over, you know, that space. And there is Ambika who sells bhajis in the evening. And she says, oh, now I feel kind of safe to kind of start selling bhajis. So, you know, I can see already in a span of 6 months how the women have kind of taken over the space. So I feel like spaces like this kind of also give us, I mean, it was not only for them, but for me also. For me, it's like having another family to go there and sit, you know. I live alone. So it was great to have this women sit there and all of us sitting and having chai. And so every Wednesday we have gossip sessions, which is also quite nice to come and sit and talk. So that's how these two spaces, yeah.
Great, thank you, Indu. That was really wonderful. Namakate is in Lingarajapuram. Everyone's welcome to also.
Naswadi railway station. So if you ever feel like just doing nothing and coming and having chai with us, please do come.
Great. We also have Dr. Chandra with us. And before I invite you to speak, I just want to say Dr. Chandra started the first dedicated comprehensive perinatal psychiatric service. I'm mostly doing this for the recording, so in case anyone watches this in the future, they should know that there is also this space to access. The first perinatal psychiatric service in Asia for mothers with mental health problems. Since its inception in 2005, the perinatal outpatient mental health clinic at NIMHANS has helped over 4,000 women with mental illness during pregnancy and postpartum. Since also started in 2009, the 5-bedded mother-baby inpatient unit, it's also the only of its kind in South Asia, has supported nearly 1,000 mothers with mental illness in their perinatal period. These are again people whose mental health needs have intensified at a particular point in life, either through their pregnancy journey and gender-based violence, which you're also an expert of, Dr. Chandra. Can you share a little bit about how some of this is also exacerbated by design of not spaces but also structures?
Thanks, Ruben, for inviting me for this and such fascinating discussion. And I'm just trying to sort of weave what you both said into what I'm going to say. First of all, a sort of disclosure. I'm a completely city woman. I've lived all my life in 4 cities in Delhi. So you can imagine, like, there can't be a bigger, better, different model of a city than Delhi. and New York, Manchester, and Bangalore. So, and every time I have moved to a city, I have tried to look at design and seen how places are inclusive for women and how, or for different kinds of women, and how, urban design actually makes a difference to mental health. And it's something that's a lasting passion of mine. And what I have also noticed is this whole issue of exclusion and how exclusion, social exclusion, makes a lot of difference to the mental health and particularly of women. And from what you were saying, it's, if they're sex workers, there's social exclusion. They just don't belong to that particular space. Domestic workers, they just come and go. We don't know their identities. So there's social exclusion. And the second thing is about a lack of connectedness. And I think that is what is, we all know that. We keep talking about it. It's there in, every time a conversation happens about cities, it's about lack of social connectedness. And that is probably related to the way cities are designed, or in terms of both services, the geography. If you look at the parks, for example, in Bangalore, they're very good examples that it's all very linear. Everybody's just walking round and round and round, not looking at each other, not talking to each other. There are hardly any places where you have like a circle where people can actually sit. Even strangers, if they kind of sit around, they will smile at each other, they will get to know each other, but that doesn't exist. So while we think of a park or a ground as a space for maybe some physical activity, we are not exploiting the spaces we have for connectedness. You mentioned about the high rates of suicide in India. People, I would like to share, and you'll be surprised to know that there's something called, universally in suicide research, there's something called gender paradox, which basically means that across the world, men die due to suicide much more than women, many, many times more than women, in most countries in the world, except in 5 countries, which is India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. These are the 5 countries where women have higher rates, or actually equal rates, and China, equal rates of suicide as men. And in a certain age group, that is the age group that you mentioned, that's the reproductive age group, like between the ages of 15 to 35, women outnumber suicides in India especially. It's a huge concern. And when we look at data about why this is happening, so in the West, suicides are basically because of untreated depression or severe depression. In India and in many of these other countries, the rates of suicide are high because not so much because of depression as a condition, but because of social determinants. And the highest among them is gender-based violence. So if we are, and the rural and urban rates are almost similar. So if we are looking at, and when we mean gender-based violence, it's not just domestic violence, but any form of gender-based violence. So as somebody, all of us know that in the spaces that we traverse in our day-to-day life, we know the kind of violence that is perpetrated. All of us have been subject to it. Nobody will not have an experience of being groped or being gazed at or being stalked or being harassed or being followed. And for some of us, this can be very, very traumatic experiences. And if that is associated with other forms of violence, it can actually just make things really worse. So I think that, one thing is of course about the fact that gender-based violence is so high, and why is it so high? Of course, it's because of several social factors, but it's also because women do not have access to their neighbors, to other forms of support, and cities are actually making that really worse. Because we know that even if there is the bystander prevention programs are really not being paid attention to. In many cities in the world, there is bystander training. So if you hear somebody in your neighborhood facing domestic violence, you're told, you know exactly what to do, whom to call, what kind of intervention to do. But in our cities, we just sort of, it's like denial. We exclude it. And that kind of leads to increase in violence. So I think this is something which we really need to take very seriously. If most of us, those of us who are researchers or into policy, have read the NFHS 5 data with the really horrific rates of domestic violence in our country, with several women actually saying it's okay. So I think that cities need to pay attention to gender-based violence. If we want to improve mental health, then things have to be safer. There have to be services which are so much more accessible. So there is a Deputy Commissioner of Police, DCP, Nisha James, who's very active in the gender space, a good friend of mine. So both of us decided we wanted to go to the one-stop center in Bangalore. There's only one-stop center in the whole of urban Bangalore, and you can imagine that that's hardly anything. So one-stop centers are basically centers that the government has done for, there's some echo. I think some recording is happening, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so, a one-stop center is a place where a woman facing violence can go to seek help. She gets legal help there, she gets help from the police, she gets help for her mental health, to some extent counseling. She can stay there with her child for about 3 days. And there are five rooms available. So Nisha and I decided we wanted to see how this works. We couldn't even find the one-stop center because it was in some dilapidated little house behind Nimhans in some area which nobody was visit. In fact, she said, being a police officer, that if I come here, I will probably be attacked or harassed, and it's so unsafe to even come to a one-stop center. So since then, of course, she has made sure that it has moved to the Majestic area, in an area where it is more accessible. But it is simple things like this which actually need to be thought through when you are planning cities, and which just shows that the safety of women and access to care is really a last priority. And if we are talking about the mental health of women, then we are, obviously not prioritizing something which in our country is the most important cause for poor mental health in women. So I think that's something that I would like to sort of highlight. It's very interesting that during the COVID time, we wanted to research domestic violence happening within the families. And we were strangely asked by the government to ask a research questions, is violence more in nuclear families or joint families? Because the hypothesis was that it was probably less in joint families. We kind of refused to do that kind of research because it was not acceptable. But since then, we've done some analysis of some of our data. So I have a cohort of mothers whom we are following up from pregnancy till now. The children are 6 years old. And we've looked at our violence data. What is interesting is during pregnancy, the violence rates came down a little and then really escalated when the child was 6 months old, 1 year, 2 years. It's really gone high now. And when we looked at the differences in violence between joint and nuclear families, very interesting what we found. What we found, we hypothesized that maybe psychological violence or emotional violence would be more in joint families, and maybe physical violence might be slightly less because there are people to protect the woman and tell the husband, look, don't beat her. What we actually found was that the rates of psychological violence were definitely higher in a joint family, but the rates of physical violence were similar in both types of families. So being in a larger joint family does not seem to be really protective. So this whole idea of what a family as a safe space is also not very true any longer. So I think that cities also need to keep that in mind. And so I would feel that, having spaces where women can access services easily, they don't have to sort of navigate their way and try to figure out things. For a woman to feel safe, which all of us have talked about, spaces where there can be connectedness so that a woman feels okay about talking to another woman that I'm facing this problem. And also, our role as bystanders, I think, is very, very important. In cities, we stop becoming bystanders. We just block things that are happening around us, including if there is a homeless, mentally ill woman lying on the road. We turn away? How many of us actually take the trouble of calling the police, calling a NGO, taking... So I think it's also, cities are not only about structure, they're also about function and our role as citizens in kind of, doing something about it. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. I think this piece about what we can do today, there's one wonderful nugget that we got from you again, to stop being bystanders and actually take action and not turn away from things. Maybe before getting to the next question, if the both of you could also answer, like, what is one thing that you do in your everyday practice to make the city safer for yourself and for people around you? This is a side question then. If anything comes to mind.
So I remember while doing the Siciliad project, there were two people in the bike. They came and stopped my scooter. And then they said, because of you, my wife is now talking back. So I found that quite interesting. And I was like, so, I mean, I didn't know she never spoke, like, what was happening? And then that was interesting to, like, then start the conversation with that person saying, okay, let's have this conversation. What is happening? Why is that a problem? You should know that, she can also have an opinion. And then he was, like, very steamed up while he spoke to me. I think we had almost an hour conversation. And then after that, he was a little bit cool. I mean, I think, and he went back. At Namakate, as you saw all those stories that are being, the cloth that is stitched, right? There was a person who was standing next door. He walked in, took one of the cloth and put it on fire. And he was like, what is this center? You ladies are attacking men. And I was like, no, that's interesting. So I think, as you asked me that question, on an everyday basis, there's firefighting happening at Namakate. Even though it's a space for leisure, a lot of people find it very uncomfortable to just watch women sit and swing. They'll be like, what is she doing? Why is there no work at home? Why is she not, like, taking care of the children? Why is she just sitting? So this whole idea of women have to be constantly productive or do something all the time is not easy to understand. So on an everyday basis, something or the other comes up at Namakate, so I'm running, and there's some, always firefighting happening. So I think this is a little too much of work, maybe.
Mine is not as interesting as this because my everyday practice is basically my classroom and my writing and my research, right? So one thing through this book, what we were trying to bring out is to look at someone not just as a worker. For instance, even if you take someone like a sex worker, he or she or a trans sex worker is just like any of us. First, we should understand that is they are caregivers, they are mothers, they are parents, they have, they have to take care, they are breadwinners, they are colleagues. So once you look at someone as just like us and as the wholesome, the human aspect of it, it's easy to understand the problems they undergo. Another instance is that again with the sex workers thing. So part of, we did nearly 3 to 4 years of ethnographic field work in Bangalore city. So naturally the everyday challenges these workers face here is mainly with the police and police atrocities. So we have to talk to the police about this. So one of the major complaints the sex workers in fact told us was whenever a sex worker face sexual abuse, it's very difficult from the side of police to take it as a complaint because it's something just like, this is your work, so how could you, even talk like this? So a couple of instances where we could be part of some of the public-facing, events, along with the Karnataka Sex Workers Union and various NGOs, and to talk to police and talk to other government officials and authorities about the work and the challenges and how could you see them as any other humans rather than just look at them as the identity as a sex worker. Another instance again, working with the waste pickers. So see, one more thing which we forget is that the whole well-being is quite a lot related to the space where we live. So many of them were living in what you call this very poor housing colonies where they don't have even private toilet facilities for them, and then they use public toilets and so on. So a couple of workers were really concerned about the fact that their daughters are, growing up, and then it's a concern for them that I can't even sleep at night, and my husband is not really listening to me or not ready to get out of the space. So that's where it's not a kind of, we could convince him, but to bring out such conversation. How is it important to get out of a space like this? And nothing, I just want to have a conversation around having a house with a washroom for my daughter, the safety of my daughter. So some of these instances, I don't know whether it can create an impact, but at least bring out. Yeah, that's how.
Thank you. I think, yeah, with this we can move to the next round, which from what I hear from all of your interventions, if I can call them, is to really start conversations, right? And it seems like when usually we talk about challenges, very quickly we say, oh, these are things that the government should do and the policy should change, etc. But in this case, it seems like even the baseline everyday conversation about this crisis is not so much on the surface, right? Particularly Mindscapes in this context is interesting because it uses cultural work to then start this wider conversation on potential needs for research and needs for policy intervention. And in that way, it would be interesting if all of you could share what are your thoughts on how stories could be used to start broader conversations, right? Not just with policymakers, but also with neighbors, with family members, with friends, with workplace colleagues, and so on. So maybe if we could start with Dr. Chandra, and then.
Thank you. So I think, both data and stories are important. Some policymakers like data, in my experience, because I work a lot with policymakers trying to make them understand what is necessary. And some policymakers don't like data because then they will have to make a difference and show different outcomes, so they kind of a little shy about that. And they prefer stories because the human thing works for them. So I think and we discussed this earlier when we were talking about this topic, that I think it's very important to have a balance of both data, good evidence to show figures, because even something like the NFH is large scale, all of that, it still gives us data and it tells the policymaker, look, this is a problem. So I think, like you mentioned about mapping of safe spaces, so, looking at from the gender point of view, so it's not just safety, but it's about lighting, it's about connectedness, about caregiving. And I just want to highlight this. So women are by default caregivers, majority of the times. So they initially are moms, so they care for the babies and the children. And then as they grow older, they care for parents, and then they care for their partners or spouses. So it just kind of, the caregiving process just keeps going on, and it's highly demanding. Now, women as caregivers don't have opportunities in the city. If you look at the public transport, how many women can take their babies in their prams and go out just for getting some kind of relief, beyond that caregiving? How many women can take their husband on a wheelchair, or their father or a mother on a wheelchair, and go for a outing in public transport? You look at cities like London, New York, there are women with prams all over. There are people in wheelchairs all over. So I think if we think that women as caregivers have a huge burden and it impacts their mental health, then we need to provide facilities which will actually give opportunities for that. So I think stories from every life stage are important, from a young girl who's going to school and who has to walk till the bus stop and what she faces, to stories of an adolescent, to the story of a young college-going girl, to a working woman, to a woman with toddlers, or a pregnant woman, and then sort of older women. So I think it's to women with disabilities. We have not even talked about them, you know, to women with sensory disabilities or people who are neuroatypical. So you know, last week in London, there was a huge exhibition of neuroatypical artists, and to bring into focus what are the kind of challenges which people who are not neurotypical face. I think these are things which we are not even going anywhere near. So stories like this are very powerful, and the lived experience then becomes very powerful. So, in fact, most research or most policies which are being done across the world now actually have experts by experience. They call them experts by experience. That is, people who have experienced something actually are the experts. And they're given as much credence and as much voice as the so-called knowledge experts. So I think getting these stories and putting them out there, including positive stories, you know, things that people actually did which made a difference would really help, I think.
Well, maybe if either of you want to speak about mapping also, which Dr. Chandra talked about, and yeah, the merits of it.
Just before that, the stories, I remember one instance, I mean, in Kerala, Calicut. So there, the first time, the women street vendors and women who were working as sales girls, they came together, and their strike was for mainly to get a washroom, because in most of these shops they didn't have a toilet facility. So these women, they usually leave their homes early morning by 7 or so, and they reach home only after 7 or 8, and nearly 12 hours they couldn't even pee. That's the thing. So they were, and the strike went on, and it took nearly 4 years. So the shop, first they approached the shopkeepers, and they were saying that don't drink water. That's a solution. Or in these streets, maybe one public toilet will be there, and there will be long queue. And then we know that how difficult for women to go to a public toilet, like the gays and the condition in this. And many of them started having a lot of mental issues. And the thing is that to not even drinking water. I still remember that. And that finally came out, the formation of the informal women workers union. Alternative forms of union and demand for that. And in Kerala, it actually finally went into an act. State government passed an act where all the shops and establishments are supposed to have a toilet facility for their workers. So that's a very positive thing. And same thing for the sales girls. They were never allowed to sit. So that was another strike for to get a chair, you know. So that was another thing. So it was another important thing which Kerala state government finally came up with. It's actually quite embarrassing, right? A state like Kerala where it's always pro-labor and then the worker union. But the interesting thing is that the mainstream worker unions were not ready to listen to it, because that is highly, you know the nature of such unions, right? So they didn't consider these are major worker concerns. So this is a very positive story. And then coming to mapping, so in our research in Bangalore, one thing we felt that whenever we think about urban or a city, it's important we always look at it either through urban planners, or the urban imaginary is always kind of a top-down. So we want to look at urban transition from the eyes and the feet and the narratives and the oral histories of street-based sex workers. And with their help, we came up with a couple of maps. Could you please show that, Rohan? So we were looking at the entire city. You know, it's impossible to cover the workers. So we were looking at a couple of major spots. So this is Majestic. So through their narrative, so could you please move to the, so here you can see, you know, by the way, these are caricaturish maps we drew, you know, we have done this. But see this, it's based on their narratives, they was telling us, so these are the areas which they can't, it's not part of their workspaces anymore. So for the, as I had mentioned earlier, we were looking at male, female, and transgender sex workers. So for female sex workers, lodges were the main workspaces, but those who know the city very well, you know that in Majestic, most of the old lodges were no more there. So that means they lost such workspaces. And for transgender workers and also for male sex workers, public toilets are one of their major workspaces. But in this city, we know that how many, again, we don't have any data about this. But we could see that the number of public toilets which has come down over a couple of years. So could you please move again? So this is MG Road. Again, if you go to the next one, we can see that this is the, MG Road is anyway not really friendly for transgenders and sex workers. And it is quite common police come in their jeeps and then, announce their names and then lathi charges and so on. So this is another thing. And thanks to metros and all these changes, whether it is shopping complexes. And another major thing is, especially in Majestic area, the old movie theaters, cinema halls. So that is another spot for many of the street-based sex workers. And they just gave us the whole list of cinema halls which are no more there. The Kailash and Sandosh and Menaka, Nartaki, all those. So that means they lost such workspaces, right? So here, again, this is KR Market. But here we can see that the loss of their workspaces are much lesser because it is still less neoliberal changes are much less in KR Market compared to other spots. So in this way, kind of a participatory mapping. We could do this because we used to walk around in the city with these workers, and they used to tell us, just look at this. There used to be a tea shop, and now it is a hotel. We can't go there, and the restaurant owner won't allow us to. They call it as hotel. So they won't allow us to be there. Or see that metro station, there used to be a nice open area. We used to sit there and it used to be ours. That's what one sex worker, that used to be mine, but look at that. So that's what, each one of us tell that, that's mine, that's my spot, So this is the mapping what we have done,
yeah. So I think another aspect of citizenship and belonging in a city is also to kind of understand where do we belong? Where are we staying? What's happening around us? Do we know which ward we belong to? Who is the ward committee member? Every second Saturday, there are ward meetings that are open to public. How many of us have attended these things? So in terms of policy and change making, I think it is also important to start from ground level to kind of understand our surrounding first, because public memory that we are trying to create and the citizenship and the cultural capital that we're creating in the city is also to understand our surroundings, right? To start from there. So I would attend these meetings very often, and I remember the BBMP councillor who was there, the corporator, he was deciding, because there was a huge fund for women and children, and he was deciding what women want. So he would be like, okay, they have to sit at home, so we have to give them sewing machine. They need pressure cookers. So the decision makers were very much, very gendered in that way. But there were no other representation of other genders on on the level of decision making. So in that way, how are we impacting, right? How are we bringing in some kind of stories into these spaces? I remember I wrote a long, huge project proposal, and we got approval to start Bangalore's first ever all-female library. Because I spoke about a leisure space initially, and they were like, no, we don't want that. So then I had to make it a library, saying, okay, this is a space, and it is, for women to come and read, but at the same time, they can also sit and relax. This was before the pandemic. We got the whole fund to start it. Even the base was started, the cement was laid, but then the pandemic hit, and then the whole budget then moved into COVID relief funds. So now we're trying to restart the conversation, but the elections haven't happened. BBMP elections haven't happened for the past 2 years. So all these things, again, are huge obstacles in the policy-making sector as well.
Thank you. Maybe with that, we can open up. We have about 30 minutes to go. So in case if anyone has questions, comments, if there's anything you want to share. Oh, wow.
I'm saying ask anything.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share one thing before, So while you were talking, during the pandemic, when the parks were opening up, so there's a huge lake near where I live, and the parks were just opening up. And when I went for a walk one day, I found that the families with young babies and children were being turned away from the park because there was a policy that children should under 12 should not be allowed in parks. I mean, these are the families that probably need it. And so I wrote to the BBMP counselor and I said, what kind of a ridiculous rule is this? If you want, you talk to the COVID task force and, check with them that this is not medically or scientifically, doesn't make sense. And it did make a difference. They actually opened up the park. So I think, like you rightly said, it's about us also trying to make a difference. And right now what we're trying to do is, so all the parks in the BDA layouts they lock the gate at I think 9 o'clock or something like that, and then open it again. Now the women can only come out at that time. If you go to the parks in the morning, who are the women who are walking around and around? It's the slightly older women, who don't have to fix lunch boxes and things like that. So the women who actually need to be walking and going out into gardens and parks during the day, that's the only time they have, and they don't have access to it. So now we're trying to write to the BBMP and saying their logic is it's not a safe space, we don't have security during the day, and nefarious activities will happen. So, but then, so do something to make sure that the women feel safe during. So I think these are things that we can do, and sometimes, like you say, that the people out there are looking from a completely different lens, and this may not even occur to them. And so it's our duty to actually inform them about this,
Good evening. I'm Chandana, and thanks a lot for a beautiful session. It's really insightful, and all three of you have been working in very important domains pertaining to women and their safety in the city. As a solo traveler, I've faced a lot of issues in terms of molestation, harassment, and all of these. And at one point, as a woman, you get to know what is going to happen with you in which kind of space. You are perceptive about that. So I devised my own strategies to how to travel alone and how to survive in the city and do all of that. As an urban designer, I have also thought about how spaces have to be designed, and a lot of things have been overlapped in terms of thought, psychology, and all of that. But the main conflict as an urban designer I've always had is about the genderedness of space. For example, we're talking about Namakatte or any space for that matter. The initiatives taken to make a woman feel safe are mainly woman-centric. But what I believe or what I think is also to make men more empathize towards women. And when we talk about Namakatte as a space, I then thought about how chopals are used in North for male-centric spaces and how women feel a certain way towards chopal. So how do we actually ensure that both the gender feel equally safe in a space and they understand each other and there is a confidence gained and there is a codependence in both the genders which is created, which is most important, because what happens is, for example, just to empower women, AAP government had come up with free tickets for women. It's not like we can't pay for our ticket. It's not like we need some concessions for us to travel, but it's just about the bus stops being safer, the streets being safer, and a lot of such things being happening. And what ultimately happens is people giving us undue advantage or some things which we really don't require as such. We are individuals who can actually take care of ourselves. So the question is about how this codependence between the genders can be created and how can they actually function together. As ma'am rightly said, that it's not about identifying ourselves as a different person. We all are same ultimately. It's not about me being a woman or you being a man ultimately. So it's just a wondering that I've always had. Yeah.
Give you a small example. I always talk with examples. So I remember there was quite a bit of boys sitting outside Namakate, and they saw these women sharing stories, and they said, you know, I also want to share. I said, yeah, of course, why not, you know, share. Here's a piece of cloth, and why don't you stitch it? And he started stitching, and then he's like, oh, this takes so much time. I don't know why these women are doing these things. So I was like, what is the meaning of all this? And then what happened is, I remember him, so now, if you go there, he'll always be sitting there. So I'd be like, what are you doing here? So he'll be like, I'm now protecting this place. I don't need to stitch, but I'll sit and protect. So in that way, I see a huge, you know, like they all talk to each other and they all start owning up to the space. And now all the boys have TikToks and they make reels at Namakate. And the other day they were all following the Instagram page that we just recently created, and they were very saying, oh, we are at Namakate, and they're doing all these songs and dances and things. So in that way, there is an engagement. And I believe definitely, as you said, it's not just about a certain gender, but at the same time also having conversation in multiple levels and bring in as much of dialogue as possible in these spaces. And it's not like, I remember one of the ladies sitting at Namakate was like, oh, why is she wearing such a short skirt? So it's not just, you know, only one-sided in that way. Everybody has our own social constrictions to these things. So I think, yeah, definitely having dialogues help. Yeah.
Can I respond to that? So thanks, Chandana, for that. That's such a wonderful point. So as somebody who works in maternal mental health, we've been working closely with maternal nutrition also. And one of the things that the UNICEF, for example, found is that even though there were so many nutritional SOPs being given, medication and anemia treatment, nutrition was not improving. And one of the things they found was that it was because of this gendered nature of eating in families, particularly in rural families, but also in urban families. So women eat last and least, you know, everywhere, including pregnant women. Many women come into a family because of patriarchality. They are moved from one place to another, obviously, and they are in a new family, they get pregnant, they can't even ask for food, they're so scared. So it was recognized that there needs to be a change. And they also felt that this was causing a lot of anxiety as well as probably depression among pregnant women and postpartum women. So we then had a lot of brainstorming with organizations, self-help groups, and you'll be glad to know that in Chhattisgarh and Telangana, we've started a project which basically looks at gender transformative interventions. So these interventions are not just male engagement, because like you say, if you just do male engagement, sometimes it becomes about I'm protecting the woman or I'm, you know, helping them kind of a thing. Okay, you told me to look after her, now we look after her. We don't want that kind of a thing. So it is being done through Parivar Chaupals. So in Chhattisgarh, in Telangana, it has a different name. It's done in the city in Telangana. And in Chhattisgarh, it's being done in Bastar, in really rural Bastar, where we have Parivar Chaupals, where the husbands come, and we are using many participatory methods to get them to understand through games, through using stones and basic stuff about workload, about what it really means to kind of internalize the whole experience of what it means to be a woman and how they kind of need to change and understand. It's very interesting because when there were only women facilitating the groups, the participation was not great, or the men would feel very shy. And it was only when we got some male champions to kind of do this, it helped more, because otherwise they were teasing each other saying, "Acha, tum abhi apni biwi ke piche ja rahe ho," and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of, we need to work through the masculinity myths and things like that. But it's gradually happening. The amount of such interventions the number of such interventions are very few. So as part of this work, we did a scoping review in all the low and middle income countries around the world, looked at all data evidence, and there were only 6 studies and 6 interventions which have been researched on gender transformative interventions related to mental health of women in this period. So I think it's the way that most funding agencies and interventions are actually going. So what you're saying is so true and so right, and I think the way forward is to focus on some of these interventions. And when we mean gender, we obviously cannot only think of a cisgender. We need to kind of look at the whole spectrum, but that will probably happen gradually when we take these first steps. So thanks for that really important comment.
Hello, I'm Deepa. I'm a PhD candidate, and I thank you. This is a very fascinating talk. And what I found very interesting is that in my PhD study as well, I found that it's not just urban design or access to land, city, that plays a crucial factor, but it is access to means, processes, and social networks. So, so I found it, I mean, I think that's something that's, access to social networks plays a really key role. So I think both access to social networks and connection which can be facilitated through urban design. Those two factors, it was really fascinating that you brought that out. And also in terms of play and art, the role of that, I think those were like, those would be really significant. But yeah, I came too late, so I'm still to understand labor, the aspects of labor. So I should probably read more into that. But it was really very fascinating to think of urban design, because I've really been looking at rural, and the transition for me is more in terms of just negotiating the urban, because of course it's intersectional and it depends on various classes and gender, but the urban is also a difficult terrain, which is sometimes for if you're coming from the rural, it's more difficult to negotiate the urban than it is to negotiate a very rugged terrain. So that is something that is also something in terms of access to the city that that just came. Maybe you would want to speak about it as well. But thank you so much.
Yeah, I am Dr. Nabagata. Thank you for a wonderful session. I just had a comment. We spoke about women at disadvantage from lower socioeconomic status. What I wanted to point out also was that being women who are at an advantage, are from higher or middle socioeconomic status, now, as urban citizens, we are so aware of space and boundaries. Sometimes, even if we hear women, neighbors or anyone else in this, the streets, being asking for help or crying out for help, we sometimes really, because we feel that we might be encroaching on their privacy, we don't really respond. So one thing I wanted to, point out that apart from the women who are facing a double minority, like not only from an economic standpoint, but also from a gender disadvantage, also the women who are, in a, who we call as in an advantage in according to the socioeconomic status, also might need some help. That is where ma'am's, what she said about the bystander training comes into picture. So I thought it might be a point to explore.
Again, and just an observation and maybe an insight was, since, I also work closely with transgender folks, and I feel And intervention in schools is also very important because the gender roles start from there, from their homes. And we did a couple of workshops which were conducted by the transgender people in government schools. And it was extremely fascinating to understand how a child perceives gender roles and how it is so ingrained in their upbringing because they are also from lower economic backgrounds. And it was fascinating for them to also understand that the girls could speak up. And it started as simple as what are the kinds of jobs you think a girl can do, or what are the kinds of jobs you think a boy can do. And a whole classroom answers that. And there is a open argument between boys and girls that why do you think we can't do carpentry, or why do you think we can't do painting or a wall painting, you know? So I think even having educational policies is so important and crucial, especially because I hear so many people from the trans community who are unable to finish school because of being treated badly in school. And of course, a lot of girls. And nowadays, there are a lot more cases coming up which have been so severely affected in schools. And so maybe some interventions with the educational policies, or some data or some kind of a intervention in schools are also essential, is just a comment.
I mean, I've also been curious about how many of these kids would also have lived the past 2 years at home, right? And not in a social setting, in a school which already teaches you how to mediate things, so on and so forth, right? Like even modulating emotions or figuring out when to be happy or not sad or what, and so on and so forth. Like, I wonder if you have any sort of early hunches about this, how particularly for younger developing minds, this would be so transformative for a lifetime, right? And in some ways, we know Dr. Rukmini Banerjee at Pratham talks about how, in fact, since kids haven't gone to school, this is such an opportunity to actually rethink foundational learning, because kids can really be retaught things that haven't been, sort of in the system right now. But what if you have any insights on that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's, of course, the national education policy is another thing altogether, and, all the issues that are happening with that. But I think the pandemic has, resulted in a few things. One is, of course, that the kids are finding it even more hard to negotiate the world, because they have been out of circulation. And in fact, many children are saying, why can't we just do online classes? Like, why do we even have to socialize? Because socialization requires its own skills, and it is challenging. So those children who have difficulties with others have actually found the pandemic to be really very useful for themselves. But having said that, I think we also must remember that school and spaces where kids meet, not just school, but other spaces where kids meet each other, are a very good place to, like you said, for emotional regulation, for how to handle conflicts, how to look at people who are different, how to accept them, how to talk to each other. So all of that, I think, we've kind of lost for about 2 years. And it is going to be quite difficult to, for people to go back into that space and relearn things other than just studying and doing things online. So I think it's very important. But also to sort of go back to your point, there are interventions that are happening in Bangalore, at least, in government schools, where a lot of government schools have been taken up for gender-based kind of interventions and education. And it's very interesting that government schools are, from the person who's doing it is my colleague, and I've been talking to her, and she was like, it's really interesting how open they are. And they are actually talking about some of these things. And when we talk about gender, we're not only talking about binary, but, about various hues and colors. And And I think, so it's interesting to see that it's not only the elite schools which may be open to some discussions, but it is actually happening. And it's, so the child and adolescent mental health department in Bangalore, in NIMHANS, is working with interestingly with Miss Nisha James from the police, who feel that a lot of the changes that are happening in relation to violence and all should start from schools. And so they are actually, through the Nirbhaya Fund, have funded gender sensitization in government schools. And this has started, and it's proving to be quite successful, which was a little surprising, but because they thought it would be very challenging. So I think initiatives are happening, maybe need to be written about more and discussed more in public, but it is sort of slowly and gradually happening. Whether it will happen at the educational policy level, because there are so many other factors which come into the national education policy, it's very centralized, it's very controlled by one body, we don't know, but at least local initiatives can happen.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, then maybe we can. Okay. Yeah, I think it's time for us to close. Maybe a couple of things from our end. Indu's project is ongoing right now at Namakate. It's gonna, all the pieces of tapestry that you saw will be stitched together and will become a piece that gets exhibited, not just as map, as I understand, but also other parts of the city. Heath is doing this wonderful work around mental health and the city, particularly with sex workers and other marginalized groups. These are all multiple projects that will come together in April next year, and we'll share with you more about that, so keep an eye out. Welcome, which is supporting this piece of work, also has several other opportunities out right now for research on mental health, so if you're interested, you can look that up. And yeah, today's was, I would like to believe, the starting conversation where we talked about making the space and calling it a thing. Hopefully, the next time we meet, we talk about desire and pleasure and things that truly make us happy and how to make more and more space for that. This is something that I'm personally learning, to take more space. And I know when we do that, we want to do it together for more people who've just not had their space for very long. I hope you all be with us on that journey. So thank you. Thank you again, Indu. Thank you, Neeti. Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Thank you, Asha. Cheers. Have a good evening.